So how are we to understand the United States' proliferating use of sanctions in the 21st century and of the SSOT designation, which is particularly pernicious variant of sanctions in that it cuts off access to indispensable international monetary and financial infrastructures, without which a state becomes a sort of international persona non grata in the world of commerce. Why were sanctions and the SSOT designation on Cuba both lifted under the Obama administration and diplomatic relations established? And while the Trump administration's reimposition of sanctions and the SSOT designation can be dismissed as part of the rogue president's trademark sadism, why did Biden not undo them until the very end of his term, when he knew that the returning Trump administration would only reimpose them? To answer these questions, we must place sanctions and economic warfare more generally, which are wrongly viewed as more humane than war, in the framework of the international relations of the age of capital. These international relations are centrally about imperialism. They are governed by the horizontal logic of inter-imperial relations of conflict as well as cooperation, and by the vertical logic of imperial subordination and resistance to that imperialism. The use of sanctions as a form of war since the early 20th century is implicitly or explicitly contrasted with the 100-year period between the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War, often called the 100 Years' Peace, when war appeared to be neatly separated from international economic relations. After the Congress of Vienna, Karl Polanyi argued in his Great Transformation that effective safeguards were erected for the continuance of peaceful business in wartime. The wars of the French Revolution furnish us with the last important examples of the confiscation of the private property of enemy subjects found in belligerent territory upon the outbreak of hostilities. In respect to the status of enemy aliens, the service of loans held by enemy citizens, enemy property, or the right of enemy merchantmen to leave port, the 19th century showed a decisive turn in favor of measures to safeguard the economic system in wartime. Only the 20th century reversed this trend. This was regarded as progress delivered by capitalism. Of course, we must underline that such respect for the sanctity of the private property and for capitalist commerce did not apply to the colonies even then. European countries considered one another members of a society of nations in a civil state which respected private property. Those outside this pale were to be shown no such curtsies, as we know from the history of colonialism. Colonial nations were to be forcefully opened up to European capitalist commerce, and the full range of means from war to deindustrialization to famine and starvation could be employed without any restrictions and were employed in the colonies. The 100 Years' Peace was preceded by a British blockade against Napoleon starting in 1806, to which the French emperor responded with the continental system. That 100 Years' Peace then ended with the British blockade against Germany during the First World War. Both had demonstrated the superior power of the British Navy over Britain's foes. Though this success inspired the writing of multilateral sanctions into the League of Nations Charter, the record since has been mixed, to say the least. League sanctions, of course, failed dismally to stop the war. After the Second World War, the United Nations Charter reserved the use of sanctions to the multilateral body. Though this inclusion is premised on the false assumption that somehow sanctions are less lethal and so more humane, thanks to the inclusion of Russia and China among the permanent members of the Security Council with vetoes, multilateral sanctions were used sparingly as long as the Cold War lasted. However, even during the Cold War, the United States, with its historical propensity to use economic warfare, which goes back to the days of its gunboat diplomacy, was not able to resist the use of illegal unilateral sanctions when it applied them against countries affiliated to the Soviet Union, and that, of course, included Cuba. After the demise of the Soviet Union, the appearance of the United States' unipolarity allowed the US to orchestrate multilateral sanctions through the United Nations for a while, though these possibilities wore off as other countries, particularly Russia and China, wised up to US intentions. Thereafter, in the new century, the United States has resorted increasingly to illegal unilateral sanctions as part of its now unconstrained aggression worldwide. The overwhelming majority of sanctions today emanate from the United States, with the EU and European countries running a distant second. One US Treasury report registered a nearly tenfold increase in sanctions from 2000 to 2021, from 912 sanctions in 2000 to 9,421 in 2021. Those depriving Cuba of essential imports, including ventilators during COVID, are, of course, among these proliferating sanctions. How are we to understand this? The literature on sanctions is bifurcated into two distinct streams. The first stream documents the horrifying effects of sanctions on civilians, particularly when wielded against weaker states. In a rare consensus, scholars agree that sanctions impose intolerable and entirely illegitimate human costs. This literature has forced the United States and the West to impose so-called smart sanctions on individuals rather than entire nations, and to lock in humanitarian exceptions, though it is not clear that their effects are any less lethal. Sanctions continue to devastate societies, and Cuba, with its ever-deteriorating economy of an increasingly patchwork socialism, with no adequate replacement for the Soviet-supported ones enjoyed, is among the worst affected. The other stream of the literature on sanctions focuses on the efficacy of sanctions. It concludes in another scholarly consensus that they usually fail in deterring the target state from undertaking the actions that sanctions are aimed to prevent. If tiny Cuba still stands against more than 60 years of the most comprehensive US sanctions, and North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela remain unbowed, sanctions are hardly going to deter Russia or China. Yet they keep raining down from Washington, and to a lesser extent from Brussels, London, and other Western capitals. This apparent paradox can only be resolved if we appreciate, as I've argued in my various works on geopolitical economy, that the power of imperialism has been declining since 1914. Of course, not as fast as you and I would like, but definitely declining. That the US has had the misfortune of seeking to become the world's leading imperialist power on the model of the UK until 1914, just when the world had already become multipolar in the 19th century and communism emerged in the early 20th century. Indeed, the very developments that undermined UK dominance were destined to make US dominance impossible, no matter how zealously pursued. The result was that not only is the US not hegemonic today, notwithstanding the most zealous pursuit of this ambition, it was never hegemonic, judged by its own ambition, even though it diluted that ambition, wisely forsaking the acquisition of a territorial empire on the UK model, which would have been impossible in 20th century conditions, even if much blood and treasure were expended. And there is no evidence that the US was ever eager to expend much blood and treasure. So the US settled for making the dollar the world's money on the model of sterling. Given, however, that sterling was not a national but an imperial currency, and that the sterling system rested on Britain's imperial inability to suck surpluses out of its non-settler colonies and export them as capital to its settler colonies and to Europe, the dollar could not replace it. Forced to supply liquidity by running deficits, the US first bled gold, and then, after the dollar's gold convertibility had to be ended in 1971, has had to rely on vast, volatile, and crisis-prone expansions of financial activity to maintain the dollar's world role. This is an expedient whose contradictions are now approaching breaking point, which is why you hear so much about de-dollarization. These financializations have, moreover, weakened the United States' own economy, and to the extent that the rest of the Western world has followed the US, also their economies. And alongside the rise of socialist China, and to a lesser extent the other BRICS, are accelerating the decline of imperialism, and as well as US power, and of course, advancing multipolarity. US militarism and economic aggression today are prompted by a desperate desire to undo this verdict of history. However, neither military nor economic aggression is particularly effective. Just as the US has had a rather sorry record of military efficacy, consider Korea, Vietnam, and then, after overrunning tiny Panama or Grenada, its inglorious string of 21st century wars, so today its sanctions are also ineffective, most spectacularly against Russia, but also against its lesser targets. They can't even manage regime change in tiny and vulnerable Cuba. So today, US sanctions are not any sort of kinder alternative to war, as the US's ability to undertake military effort diminishes with the loss of technological superiority in arms, lack of coherent strategic thinking, and the unpopularity of wars among US citizens. Sanctions have become a principal means of US war. The US continues imposing sanctions today chiefly from a certain kind of madness. Nikolai Petro points out in the case of sanctions against Russia that they can be sold as an alternative to a war-weary nation. Without any clear way of measuring success, they can always be portrayed as successes, providing an escape from the reality of failure. With the imposition of each bout of sanctions, Petro argues, Washington experiences a political high. And then, eventually, this political high wears off. The nastiness of the world intrudes. Once politicians become desperate for another, and politicians once again become desperate for another fix. Friends try to warn Americans that Washington's increasingly erratic behavior is beginning to hurt them as well. But how can they understand the burdens that America must bear as leader of the free world, which is why they can ignore these friends' advice. Eventually, as Americans' view of the world shrinks to the Washington Beltway, nothing but their own media-driven reality matters. Sanctions now provide the only semblance of calm, the only relief that politicians can rely on, so resort to them becomes habitual. In a similar vein, there is no evidence the US has any coherent strategy for Cuba. The imposition of sanctions provides, at best, a verisimilitude of power and pacifies constituencies of Cuban exiles in Florida and New Jersey. Thanks very much.